and welcome to the Donmar Warehouse's Climate Conversations series. Today is episode 3 of our podcast series, where we're talking about Jackie Sibley-Drury's play, Marys Seacole. My name is Claire Slater. I'm the head of new work at the Donmar, and I'm delighted to host this series of conversations between leading artists and leading climate and social justice thinkers. Our hope is that bringing these inspiring people together will help us all reconsider what it means to make theatre in the context of climate crisis. These climate conversations have been curated by Zoe Svensson. Zoe is our associate artist. She is a director and an academic in drama and performance at the University of Cambridge. She is currently working as the Donmar's climate dramaturg. Her research is enabling us, our artists and our audiences to take this step back and ask, how can the stories we tell and the ways we produce them contribute to a climate-positive future? Joining me and Zoe today is Nadia Latif, the director of Marys Seacole. Her other work includes the critically acclaimed Fairview at the Young Vic, where she was associate director from 2018 to 2020. Also in 2020, she was a fellow of the Sundance Screenwriters Lab. With us today also is Courttia Newland. He has published 9 works of fiction, including his debut, The Scholar. His latest collection of speculative fiction stories, Cosmogramma, was published in 2021 by Canongate. As a screenwriter, he has co-written 2 feature-length films for the Steve McQueen BBC series Small Axe, of which Lovers Rock was jury-selected for Cannes. Indra Adnan is also joining us today. She's a writer, psychosocial therapist, and political entrepreneur. She is founder and co-initiator of The Alternative political platform, and is a global consultant on soft power. All of these brilliant brains are joining me today to think about Nadia's production of Marys Seacole. Together, we'll explore its themes of care and intergenerational legacies of colonialism, all in the context of the climate crisis. So, may I start, Nadia, with you? Could you tell us a little bit about Marys Seacole? What's it about? What world has Jackie given us in this play?
Yeah, so Marys Seacole is a play by the brilliant Jackie Sibley-Drury about, ostensibly, about the life of Marys Seacole, the Scottish-Jamaican nurse, hotelier, adventurer. But I guess within the kind of guise of a biopic about Marys Seacole, the woman, it becomes a kind of kaleidoscopic play looking at the position of Black women as caregivers and across history, and how we've always figured as people who give care but maybe aren't given care necessarily by other people, but also by narratives, and about what the cost of giving care is.
What drew you to Marys Seacole in the very first place?
Yeah, in my old age, I'm becoming more controlling about process and people, and in some ways like less interested in project. It's an excuse for a group of people to develop a continuing creative language and relationship with each other, of which Marys Seacole is a stop on that journey. I felt like we had a really special connection on Fairview, and I knew I wanted to continue that. And so, it was a classic, like, let's get the band back together. I guess in many ways, Fairview announces its intention very loudly by going, we will divide you on race lines. I think Marys Seacole does something as radical, but also radically subtler. Do you know what I mean? Like, it actually asks you to be honest about who you are on this continuum of caregiving or care receiving. And you can deny it, and everybody has their own, like, individual, excuses as to why they're the exception and not the rule. But actually, I think that it fascinated me as a project about the inevitability of some things that will happen to all of us, like age and death. It's happening to all of us, doesn't care who you are, unless you're unfortunate enough to die young. But actually, that how we will behave and who will take care of us is divided by socioeconomic factors. So that interested me. We had such a wonderful time making Fairview as a team, and a young team, and a team of predominantly queer, Black and brown people. And we were all really taken by how much we could work together in ways that were not maybe the abusive ways that we had inherited. Do you know what I mean? Like, the idea that you have to make work in a certain way or wield power in a certain way. And we wanted to continue that on a play about giving care. Like, how can we give care to each other in a kind of post-pandemic moment, and particularly for the black members of the team in a pandemic that had disproportionately killed black people in this country. I don't think solutions are necessarily solved by like throwing money at the problem all the time. Sometimes it's about just giving somebody the space and the time to be like, what do you want to achieve and how do we let you achieve that, and how do I support you to achieve that? To quote Tom Scott, our designer and my best friend, it's not about stuff, it's about people. You know, a lot of that was about being kind to bodies. We had people dealing with different injuries, different illness throughout. All of that has to become about taking care of each other because you're the only group of people who can do the thing every night. That had fascinating implications with COVID. Like, we were testing every day furiously because we were so scared about somebody getting it because we had vulnerable members of the team. But actually that level of care for each other's bodies was really beautiful. And I was like, we should always have this level of care. People shouldn't come to work if they're feeling sick. Why did we ever expect people to come to work feeling sick? Like, how monstrous is that? You know what I mean? So yeah, I think it just made me look at being resource poor, which often theatre is anyway, as a way of being emotionally and kind of spiritually supportive instead. Like, if I don't have money, what have I got? I've got time. Do you know what I mean? I've got time and I've got care. Which is kind of, you know, what the show's about. Jackie puts this really well, but she says, you know, like, if you're at work and somebody's taking care of your kids, who's taking care of their kids? And I think, but that's again about like the connective tissue, like, you know, oh, I really wish I could rehearse Saturday morning. Everybody with kids isn't going to get to see their kids. So actually, is that the best use of my Saturday? Is to make them all miserable? Or actually, could I do without those 3 hours and have happier, more fulfilled, relaxed actors and create? Do you know what I mean? Like, really ask yourself whether it's worth it. I think it was all about time and care and a chance to work with some people that I adore creatively.
Hearing you talk now has reminded me that actually so much of what you said there has become inspiration for the work that Zoe's been doing with us here at the Donmar, the research project that is Climate Conversations. The language of care and taking care has really inspired so much of our thinking. And it's so lovely to sit opposite you now and hear you reflect on that. So I wanted to say thanks. And I wondered, Courttia, I wonder if I could invite you to reflect on whether what Nadia has said there chimes with your own artistic practice as a writer at all.
Yeah, I've always felt that way. I work with a lot of students, but like for me, it was more about what do you want to say? Like, and how do I help you say it? And how do I like take care of you during this process so that you feel like your voice is important and your voice is privileged? And a lot of times these were marginalized people who were coming into these spaces and wanting to be taught. And just like, how do I work with you in order to make what you imagine in your head possible on the page? I think that's the most important thing. It's the most important thing for myself as an artist, but it's the most important thing for people who are also trying to create. I was thinking more when I was watching the show about how we as human beings, people of colour, are constantly trying to express ourselves in different ways and are constantly being rebuffed, you know? And the force of energy it takes to keep going, despite the fact that there is an almighty force that's pushing in the opposite direction and trying to push you away from what you want. We want to go this way, and people are saying, no, actually, you should go this way, which is more in line with how I view you as a human being, or not as a human being in some cases, you know? And so I was watching Marys Seacole, and I was just thinking, wow, you know, she was an icon to me, actually, growing up. She was very much someone who was held up to us as a standard that we were supposed to try and at least attempt to achieve, you know? I first heard about Marys Seacole in school. The deputy teacher from our school stood up in assembly one day. I was raised in West London. And in West London, we're just a stone's throw away from where Marys Seacole was buried. And so he got up in assembly one day and said, we're not doing the Lord's Prayer today. We're not doing this, that, and the other. I'm going to tell you about Marys Seacole. And this was, you know, a white man in a school 80 to 90% full of black kids. And for a lot of us, it was the first time we'd heard of Marys Seacole. Must have been like 11, 12 years old at the time. And he was telling this story not because it was a great story, which it is, and not because she was a powerful human being, which she is, but definitely because of the impact it was supposed to have on us as young people, and primarily young people of color in that school, something we were supposed to strive for and achieve, and it always stuck in my head. But then just to see it on stage, I was very much like, wow, like that thing of having to be twice as good, that thing of having to work harder, always having to work harder and always having to push harder. I was thinking about the toll that takes on people, on human beings as artists, the things that you don't get to experience, or the privileges you don't get to have because you're working so hard towards something that is that you're being told constantly is unachievable, and you have to try and achieve it anyway, which I remember my grandmother telling me about. She was a nurse too. And some of the things that Marys Seacole had been through, my grandmother had told me she'd been through personally as well. People refusing her care, to the arts, to being an accountant or a lawyer, or or a policeman, or any of these, like Leroy Logan and Small Axe, any of these things, you're gonna find this opposing force that's pushing against you.
Can I just jump in on something that you said? Because this idea of traversing racist institutions, and that like we tell stories. You wrote a film about Leroy Logan. Jackie Sibley's story wrote a play about Marys Seacole, because it's this idea that we, as Black peoples and Black communities, and neither of those people from my own community, it must be said, uphold these people. It's like, you can do it too. But actually, in a way, it's our greatest undoing as a group of people, because we still uphold exceptionalism narratives, and we don't talk about all of the Black men who have failed to persevere through the police force. We don't talk about all the Black nurses who are still incredibly badly treated by the NHS, because it's the whole exceptional immigrant narrative. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you can come to this country and you can, or you can be invited to this country, to be very clear about how the people on the Windrush were, and you can, you can have everything. You can have a house, you can have a job, you can make a meaningful contribution to society. And I sometimes feel like we talked a lot about how that exceptionalism is sometimes used to like paper over the massive institutional problem that exists. That whole thing of like, if I just work harder, I too could be Leroy Logan or Marys Seacole or Courttia Newland or whoever. Like that is so that's how we're killing ourselves as well. Do you know what I mean? It's that whole thing of like, we're not taking care of ourselves. And there's a reason that every Caribbean woman who came in to audition for this play came in and cried, because they were just like, actually, we don't talk about these things, and this play excavates like a very basic anxiety I have within myself, which is I'm not good enough and I'm not working hard enough. That it's our fault. Like, if we just worked harder, we would somehow defeat the things that push against us.
Thank you both very much. And Indra, I feel like from your reactions to what was being said, this must intersect with some of your work. These practices of care must really chime with what you do and think about. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
If I think about the work that I'm doing, which is about inquiring into, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And it's such a massive question, but let's just talk about the care for a start. Care traditionally, is the thing that goes unpaid for. That's one of the biggest factors in our broken society, our broken economy. If we were paying for care the way that we paid for other things, and we included them in the idea of an economy, everything would change. We would have a different economy. The vast majority of people who has been hijacked by an extractive economy, their bodies are treated like machines. They're not expected to have voices, and hence our best resources are shut down. So everything that we need to bring our society back to life is basically shut down in the name of capital and growth. If care was back at the heart of everything and people's lives were opened up again, then new resources would flood into the space. We would have a chance to bring ourselves back to life again. I mean, care really, and the fact that care doesn't get paid for within the economy is core to that. It was just so many different stories emerging at the same time. And I was really grateful for that, because I don't think there is a single story there's not one single story that's going to take us out of the mess we're in. And the mess isn't even a simple mess, right? So it's not simply the climate crisis, is it? It's all the crises. It's the social justice crises underneath the climate crises.
Yeah, well, I wonder if actually, inspired by that, I could invite you, Zoe, to help us connect some of these dots, really help us unpack where we think the climate crisis does meet this crisis of care, this crisis of global inequity, this crisis of social justice. That's the heart of this Climate Conversations research project, isn't it?
Yeah, right. I mean, for me, like the climate crisis, what's happening now is just the outcome of that colonial capitalist mindset. So the whole basis of our economic structure is based on an unbelievably large-scale global theft. Capitalism works like that because it thieves and it exploits. And so the only way you get more is by someone else getting less. And what that also means is that our whole model of success as human beings is I have to be better than someone else. And that also has a massive impact on how we operate in the world and who we think we are. So, and whereas actually, if you look at all of the complex different forms you have of power and relation in the natural world, what you get is all kinds of sort of collaboration and strange shapes and things emerging, and extraordinary things emerge out of that. It's a bit like, Nadia, what you're saying about sort of the relationship between rest and care and art and the people's capacity to make, and the way that collaboration actually works when it's at its best is when you find in each other what's there, and you do what you can with what you have. Is that, then extraordinary things emerge.
Yeah, but also like the thing that it impacts how we make the stories we tell and how we tell them. Like, it has creative results. I sort of feel like quite deeply uncomfortable talking about colonialism as an idea, mainly because I'm from a colony. So, do you know what I mean? So I'm like, to me, that's just history. But I feel like it affects how you tell stories. How do you get the confidence of Shakespeare? Well, he's writing for people who look like him in a country that he's from. And I sort of feel like that whole immigrant mindset. I've read an amazing interview with Julie Dash, who directed Daughters of the Dust, which was the first film by a black woman to ever make it into cinemas. And it's an extraordinary film about the Gullah Geechee communities off the coast of South Carolina. And it's a very fractured, strange film. Let me tell you, as a black woman, it makes me weep every time I watch it. Like, it connects to me on a weird spiritual level. And I just remember an interview she gave decades ago, and they said, why is the film the way it is? It's just, it's so strange and fractured. And she said, because we are not a people who inherited the right to a beginning, a middle, and an end. Do you know what I mean? And just thinking about the shape of storytelling. And I think that every time, I think that, Courttia, when I read your short stories, I was just reading short stories by Walter Mosley and Brandon Taylor, and the short story form, or the short film form, or all of those things for black people. And I was thinking about all the kind of radical African-American cinema of the 60s and 70s, and a lot of it is quite sketch-like. And that's what I love about Marys Seacole, is it's sort of a series of sketches within an idea of a biopic. But actually, Marys Seacole did not tell her own history exhaustively. She tells about a birth, and then she's 45, and we have no idea what happens in between those two things. And I think about that, and I think about Julie Dash and that whole, if you displace a people, if you go to one country, steal a load of people and send them somewhere else, they have lost a connective tissue to their own history, to their own land. They're living in a different climate, all of those things, and how that disrupts our understanding of narrative, which is fundamentally colonial. Do you know what I mean? It's fundamentally inherited. I personally feel like I find it very hard to relate to a continuously beautifully shaped narrative the older I get, because I sort of feel like it doesn't reflect me. It doesn't reflect me as an immigrant, as somebody who's lived in many places and has a fractured understanding of the world. And I sort of feel like part of really interrogating our position as artists in the world today is really interrogating that expectation from an audience of the well-made play, film, novel, whatever that is, like that expectation is actually oppressive. It is actually another form of psychological conditioning that we are putting on a new generation of artists who are trying to make things in different ways. But actually, if I go, I want to make this set totally environmentally friendly, but then all the critics in the audience are like, why does it look cheap? You know, how do you deal with that? You know, how do you deal with that pressure on yourself of going, oh, I feel like I've failed. I feel like I'm not good enough. I feel like I'm not trying hard enough. You know, maybe if I tried twice as hard. You know what I mean? But actually, isn't it our job to recondition the expectation?
It's such this is such a huge thing that you're bringing up, and I really hope that you feel that you can rise to that in your lifetime, right? Because you know what everyone is experiencing right now is the collapse of the grand narratives, right? We're all in that collapse of, let's just call it the American dream, for example. So it's not a simple rags to riches on a growth economy basis or whatever it is that we would like to call it. You know, it's not about money now, so what is it about? Because of this 30-year so-called revolution of the internet, we're all living in a much wider, bigger space. Will there ever be one coherent narrative again? Question mark. Or is that the narrative itself? Question mark. But it does depend on people who think of themselves as having been previously excluded. I would include myself in that. Where is it going to arise from?
And this is slightly pessimistic, because I happen to think that at this point in time, actually, our minds are so colonized at this point in time that we actually don't know how to think another way.
Yep.
When I talk about people being colonized, people think I'm automatically just talking about like black and brown people, but I'm talking about everybody is part of that colonization experiment. Whether you were the colonizer or you were the colonized, you're still part of that experiment and that way of thinking. And actually, in the time when we were thinking that there was only one narrative, there were still multiple narratives at that time. You know, we just didn't acknowledge them. Those were kind of blown away from us in a sense. And they were saying, okay, well, what we're going to tell everybody is that there is only this because this suits us. And so it's difficult for us to break that mindset. And I think even when you, for like the works that I've been doing lately, A River Called Time or Small Acts or Cosmogramma, when I've managed to find a way, because it took me a long time to find a narrative and a means to be able to do that. Once I found a way, I think people are kind of like, well, why is this not behaving? Why is it not doing the thing that you're supposed to do, beginning, middle, and end? Where's your inciting incident? I get asked. And just this notion that there is only one particular way to process things is something that we've imbibed into our own systems.
But I think that's why, like, you know, I think that Afrofuturism is important, right? Like to imagine a future where we are kings and queens and everything's wonderful and the planet's saved is great. But I think part of that is knowing that you are part of ancient and rich cultures, you know, and I'm Nubian. And for me, being able to track my own history to a bunch of pyramids that I could physically see, if I drove out of my hometown by an hour, I could go and see where my ancestors were from and realise that they were building pyramids and doing maths and all sorts of things when, you know, the British were painting themselves blue and running around fields screaming. Like, that's a very important, you know, they were queens. We were the first culture in the world to have queens. And that's a very important part of me believing that I can walk into any room and say whatever the I want, is because I'm like, fundamentally, somewhere in my DNA, I believe that to be true. And to me, doing a historical biopic was not a natural like fit, maybe. Not that the play is a historical biopic, but obviously it has elements of that. But what it does, I think, reflect is that I'm really keen to let younger people who know they are the future, who have to go into the future, know about the past. And actually, that for me is connecting them to radical artists and writers and political thinkers who have come before them, because actually there is no greater reassurance about having a confidence in your own future than knowing that somebody has done it before you. Do you know what I mean? So like when I started watching like the radical left-wing cinema of, you know, from the 60s and 70s of people like Med Hondo and Sem Ben and Diop Mambeti and all those people, or you're watching like Bill Gunn in America, you know, all these people making radical films, and they made them with socialist principles, and you know, they had massive success, but success on their own terms. Like knowing, you know, Haile Gerima, who's now kind of, you know, Sankofa, and that whole idea that was invented by one, you know, Ethiopian man. And I feel actually knowing that those people came before me, that's the little like angel on my shoulder that I need in order to go into the future. So actually, I think that one of the other things is a job of reanimating archive and actually going like, because part of the colonial project is to exterminate our history. It's to say, oh, you were never here. Do you know what I mean? Like, don't, you try and find footage of black nurses from the 1950s. Woof, like we had a time, really on our research wall, it was very difficult. So part of me is like, actually, it's our job to reanimate and to almost technicolor those archives, to say you were here, you should have the exact confidence of every white Oxford-educated man because you have been here as long as he's been here. I mean, my actual hope is that we get to a place that we're so like saturated by black art that black mediocrity has become exceptional. Like that would be nice. The ability to be a bit mediocre once in a while and to not be exceptional.
I was going to invite us all for one final question, sadly, because I feel like this conversation could carry on and give us so much food for thought. But we try and conclude this series of podcasts, these conversations, by inviting those of us in the room to think about what things could our listeners do to be positive agents of change in their own lives, in the theatre sector, in broader society, inspired by these conversations about better practices of care, better narratives of the future, and hopefully a more climate positive future. What things could our listeners do to be positive agents of change?
I think we can't be complacent about the narrative we're being given. We have to be able to say, okay, I'm going to look outside of that. I'm going to look for something else, and I'm going to find that something else. But we also then have to share them. We can't keep them to ourselves.
That's brilliant, Courttia. Thank you. Anything else?
For me, the real radical change happens within relationship between people, or two people even. Sometimes it is a caregiver and a care receiver, but, anywhere really in a community, you're trying to develop a culture of care. How people listen to each other, how people are in relationship to each other can have very strong effects on reawakening the deeper narrative, of each person. What changing story they can begin to notice happens when they give time and attention to each other.
Paying greater attention feels like a recurring theme of this research in a really useful way.
Somebody described the COVID-19 pandemic to me as middle-class people staying at home and working-class people bringing them things. And I think that all of those, I would say, facile gestures of solidarity, of clapping for the NHS or, whatever it was, that was an interesting and misplaced energy to me because it felt like performative support rather than like real considered, like what does it take to support other people in my society, in my community. And I feel like the real thing for me is that all change has to come from within, so you have to like really care about it. And I would say that if you are not actively part of the solution, you are part of the problem. There's no third option within that. There's no I'm net neutral, actually. And so, look around you. If you live in London, look around you, go, actually, does my life reflect the city that I live in? Or actually, are all the black and brown people in my existence like comfortably in my record collection, but actually not on my bookshelf or not in my personal life? Or, do you know what I mean? Or not in my professional life? Actually really look around and go, what responsibility do I have to take for the monoculture of my own life? And what can I do to change that? But I do think that it is no longer good enough to live in this city and not be a part of the city, and be a part of everything that the city means.
Thank you. And Zoe, anything from you in conclusion?
Well, I think it comes back to that phrase you used, Nadia, connective tissue, that it's about if we live in a kind of ecological network of multiple influences, then there are only going to be lots and lots of different stories that are both each of ours solo but also connected to others, and that's the way that those sort of ripple effects can occur, and it's somehow trusting that. Anyway, that's what I'm going to take away from this conversation.
Look, it remains to me to say a huge thank you to you all for joining us today and giving us so much food for thought. I'm really very grateful. Thank you. Our next episode, we'll be talking about Lucas Nath's play A Doll's House Part 2. See you then.